Hello, and welcome to the next session on the Chapter 4 tissues. So we're still talking about epithelial tissue, and we've covered all of the covering and lining type of epithelial tissue. And now we're going to focus on glandular epithelium. And then once we're finished with that, we'll start connective tissue. So let's begin. This is going to be glandular epithelium. And just as the name implies, this type of epithelium produces glands in the body. So what is a gland? And that's a good question. So let's define the term gland before we go any further so we know exactly what we're talking about. So a gland is one or more specialized epithelial cells that secrete substances into ducts onto surfaces or into the blood. Okay, so one or more. So a single cell can qualify as a gland, and we've already seen examples of that when we are looking at covered and lining epithelium when we looked at goblet cells. Okay. All right, so one or more specialized epithelial cells that secrete substances into ducts, onto surfaces, or into the blood. When we think about this definition and look at the human body, it turns out that there are two basic types of glands. Number one, endocrine glands. And endocrine glands are going to secrete into, or they produce secretions that enter the bloodstream or interstitial fluid secretions that are going to enter the blood or remain in the interstitial fluid. Okay, so if we were to kind of quickly draw a little sketch to indicate that, let's just say we have a single cell here. It's producing some secretion, and we have a capillary. And so this cell is producing some secretion, whatever it might be. We don't know what it is. So it's releasing this secretion. And the choices are interstitial fluid, or it can actually enter into the bloodstream. Okay. It could stay here in the interstitial fluid and have an effect on another cell in the same region. So this substance is going to bind to some sort of protein on another cell and cause the change in behavior of some other cell. Or this substance can travel through the interstitial fluid, enter into a capillary, go someplace else in the body, and have an influence on another cell. That's what we're talking about with endocrine glands. Okay. The secretion that we're talking about is called a hormone. Okay. And you will learn about this in 40C, I believe it is. Yeah, 40C. You're going to cover the endocrine system, and you'll be talking about the various different types of hormones. So there are local hormones which don't ever enter into the bloodstream and have an effect within the local region in which they're released. And then there are other types of hormones that actually enter into a capillary and travel throughout the body, have an effect on many different areas of the body. All of those, whether they're local or travel through the blood, they're all referred to as hormones. Okay? And what they end up doing is regulating so they regulate metabolic or physiological activities of cells. Or organs. Okay. So hormones are going to have this effect, changing the metabolic or physiological activities of cells or organs. Okay, well that's one type. A second type of gland is the exocrine. The exocrine gland is going to produce secretions sometimes what they're referred to as products. So that's a term referring back to secretions. Products that enter ducts that will empty onto surfaces or the lumen of organs. Okay. So in this case, we have ducts are present. And one of the things I forgot to mention in the previous type of gland, the endocrine gland, is that there are no ducts. So let's go back and add that information. No ducts. Right. So ducts are present with exocrine glands. The types of things that we're talking about, the types of secretions, are things like mucus, sweat, earwax, I'm not giving you a complete list, obviously, milk, enzymes. Okay. So this gland is going to have a duct in some form or fashion. It's going to produce some sort of product which is going to end up on the surface of your body somewhere or in the lumen of some organ, such as perhaps digestive enzymes in the stomach. Okay. So let's take a look at example of each of those kinds of systems here. So for the first one that we're going to look at, this is the thyroid gland. Now, the thyroid gland produces about 3 different hormones. Thyroid hormone and another type of hormone which is escaping me at the moment. But it is producing a hormone. And this is the structure that is going to do that. This is a thyroid follicle. As you can see, it's so-called thyroid follicle. Okay. And these cells are producing the hormones that are associated with this gland. There are no ducts. This is not a duct here. This is just another thyroid follicle. And that's going to enter into the bloodstream. So the thyroid gland is highly vascular. That these hormones produced here will enter into the bloodstream and have an effect throughout the body. That's the endocrine gland. Okay. Another type of gland, or the other type of gland, I should say, is going to involve a duct. So here we have a sweat gland. Notice that this is stratified cuboidal epithelium. Okay. We have a duct here in the center. You can see it right there. These cells are producing what we call sweat. That's going to travel up and end up onto the surface of the skin. So that's an example of an exocrine gland. Okay. So those are the two major types of glands that we have in the body. All right. How do we classify glands? So classification of glands. There are, in fact, two different ways in which we can classify glands. So two ways to classify. And I believe it ends with a Y. I don't know. I'm not a very good speller. But anyway, you get the idea. Two ways to classify glands. Number one is structural. So structural classification. Number two is functional classification. And notice here, and this you'll see this quite often as you go through these courses, when you're classifying things, they're often broken down either in a structural way or a functional way. Again, form follows function, so we see that are playing out once again in the way that we look at our body and organize the various structures there. So let's talk about the structural classification. And in structural classification, we have two broad categories. Number one, unicellular glands. This is a one cell. An example, goblet cells. Okay. Unicellular, just a single cell. Number two, multicellular. Glands. And there are so many examples of this, one of which we just saw. In fact, both of the examples we saw with exocrine and endocrine glands are both multicellular glands. So the point that I'm making here is that when we look at structural classification, we're no longer trying to figure out whether endocrine or exocrine, but we're looking at both types of glands and trying to fit them into these two different types of categories. Is it a single cell? Is it many cells? It doesn't matter whether it's endocrine or exocrine. Does it fit this description or that description? That's structural classification. The functional classification structural classification is looking at it from how the product is released from the cell, and what mechanism is being used to release the product from the cell. And there are three basic ways in which that can happen. Number one is the merocrine glands. And endocrine glands use exocytosis to release the product. And I'm going to show you some examples of these in just a little bit. The second category is apocrine glands. And these are going to pinch off a part of the cell. So instead of going through exocytosis, we produce a product, we collect it at the apical end of the cell, and then we pinch off that top part of the cell, and the entire part of the cell that's pinched off is the product, or becomes the product that's being released. So endocrine, apocrine glands. And the third category is holocrine. And this is where the whole cell becomes the secretion. So the cell produces something within it, it collects it, it concentrates it, and then the entire cell is sloughed off and becomes the product. All right. So let me show you some examples. First, we're looking at the structural classification. And I'm going to show you this, and I'm going to urge you something. I'm going to tell you something about this. So this is all the different ways that structural classifications can be broken down. So all of these are examples of different structural classifications for glands. So within structural classifications, we can break them down into other subcategories. So simple branch, simple collar, coiled, tubular, simple acinar, all these different ways in which these glands can be broken down. I do not want you to memorize all of these various subcategories. So just know that the structural classification is based on how it looks. Okay, so this is clearly multicellular. There is no example here on this page of a unicellular cell. So all of these are multicellular glands in various varieties, if you will. Okay, so multicellular glands. This, on the other hand, is what you would see for the functional classification. So as you can see here, in the top picture, we have the endocrine and some examples of this type of thing. So we have exocytosis. So we're building something. So here's the rough ER. This is a protein. So, and then it's being sent. I'll get that in focus. There we go. Then it's being sent to the Golgi complex, and then we're forming vesicles, and those vesicles are then released and the product is out of the cell. So that's exocytosis. The salivary glands are an example of this process. The pancreas, also the enzymes that are produced in the pancreas are released in this fashion as well. So these are, that's endocrine type of gland. Here's the apocrine. As you can see, we're going to produce something, and then it's going to be collected at one end of the cell, and then that end is just pinched off, and this whole thing now becomes the product. So this would be an example of this would be milk from the mammary glands. So that's the way you would, as you're an infant and a newborn, consume milk, is in this form here. Okay. And the final example is the holocrine. So here we're going to build something in a cell, and we're showing you here in this image that we have to go through cellular division, because if the entire cell is the product, we have to find a way to keep replacing these cells. And so we're going to get cell division, and the top cell or the top daughter cell is going to be separated, and then it's going to collect whatever it is that's going to be manufactured. It's going to be the entire cell, becomes the secretory product. So the sebaceous glands or oil glands do it this way from the skin. Okay. So those are the functional classification of exocrine, of functional classification of glands. So there you go. And let's see what else we have to know. All right, so that really summarizes all of the epithelial tissue. So that's all we need to know for epithelial tissue. And what we're going to cover now is connective tissue. So let's take a look at connective tissue. All right, connective tissue. A couple of general statements that we can make about connective tissue is it's the most abundant and widely distributed tissue in the body. So there's more of connective tissue than any other type of tissue that we are composed of. It has a very diverse it's very diverse in form, and as you can imagine, also function. So the more different forms we have, the more different functions we're going to get. All right. Let's talk about some characteristics of connective tissue. So characteristics. Okay. Number one, connective tissue consists of two elements. Number one, something called an extracellular matrix. And that is composed of protein fibers and a ground substance. And number two is cells. Okay, so these cells are scattered within the matrix. And there are many different types. So many different types of cells. So the first characteristic is that it consists of two elements. Those two elements are extracellular matrix and cells. The extracellular matrix is further broken down into proteins and something called a ground substance, both of which we will be talking about in just very shortly in detail, as well as cells. So consists of two elements, extracellular matrix, cells. The cells are scattered within the matrix, and there are many different types of cells. Okay, so this is very unlike epithelial tissue in terms of its composition and structure. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about, oops, I'm not done with characteristics. Let's finish those up. Okay. So that was number one. And now we're going to do number two. We're still under characteristics. Okay? Not usually found on surfaces, okay, of the body. Okay? It's usually covered with epithelial tissue. Okay? It's not exposed, generally speaking. It's not exposed. So as you go through, or as we go through and look at various types of connective tissue, almost all of them will have some sort of covering around them that has epithelial tissue as part of its composition. So, for example, bones have something called a periosteum, and this is a thin layer of tissue that surrounds the bone tissue, and part of that layer is composed of epithelial cells. So this is typical, and we'll see this all the time as we go through and look at the human body. The connective tissue is generally never covered by some sort, never exposed, and is usually covered by some sort of layer, and that's typically epithelial tissue. Number 3, it has a rich blood supply. So it's very vascular. This is unlike epithelial tissue, which had no blood supply. And the exception here is cartilage, which has no blood vessels within it. And it is reduced, that is, the blood supply is reduced in tendons. And if you look at both of those things, cartilage and tendons, and realize that if you have injuries in either of these, they are slow to heal. And that is because they have either, in this case, the cartilage, no blood supply, or in tendons, a very reduced blood supply. And so all of the nutrients and the energy that's required to repair tissue comes very slowly to the cells that are doing the repairing, and thus the process itself is slowed down. The 4th characteristic is that it contains nerves. Okay. And again, we have an exception, and that is going to be cartilage once again. So nerves are found within this tissue. All right. So those are the basic characteristics that identify connective tissue. Let's take a look at some of the functions of connective tissue. Okay. Number 1, it binds the body together. Okay? And a good example here would be ligaments. Literally holds the body together. Number 2, supports the body. Okay? And bones are an obvious and good example of how connective tissue supports your body. Okay. Number 3, strengthens the body. And we should add body organs here. So, for example, the pericardial sac, which is the covering around the heart, the outer covering, part of that layer is dense irregular connective tissue, which strengthens and the structure of that layer. Okay, strengthens body organs. And number 4 on our list is going to be protects. And again, very obvious example would be bones, such as the bones that surround the central nervous system. Number 5, insulates the body. And here we can talk about adipose tissue. Number 6, it's not usually found, excuse me, sorry, that is not what I wanted. I wanted compartmentalizes structures. So a good example of this would be dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay. So dense, irregular connective tissue can be found surrounding groups of muscles and a very variety of other structures. So it creates compartments within the body. And we'll see that play out in a number of instances, especially when we're looking at muscles. We'll see that quite clearly. Number 7, it transports substances. Within the body. And obviously, one of the very classic examples would be blood. That is a connective tissue. Number 8, stores energy. And again, we can talk about adipose tissue. Number 9, stores minerals. And bones are a good example of that. And the last one, number 10, it's part of your immune defense, so it has an immune function. And this would be both blood and lymph, which is fluid found in the lymphatic system. So both of these fluids are considered to be connective tissue, and both of them are very closely connected to your ability to fight off disease. So it's part of the immune function of your body. So quite a bit of different functions. And as we said, a lot of variety in terms of what these connective tissues look like. Let's take a quick look at a typical view of connective tissue. And we'll just kind of summarize as we look at that what we've been talking about. So here's an image, a typical image of connective tissue. Remember that connective tissue is composed of extracellular matrix and cells. So let's focus on the cells first. So one of the things that we said about the cells is that there are a lot of different types of cells, and you can see that quite clearly here. We have mast cells, neutrophils, plasma cells, fibroblasts, eosinophils, macrophages, adipocytes. So a lot of different types of cells are found in connective tissue. And notice that they're all scattered about. They're not closely packed together. And we'll go in later on in just a bit and describe the different types of cells and what they mean and what their function is. And then there's the extracellular matrix, which remember is composed of 2 parts, fibers and a ground substance. And you can see the fibers here. So the big ones here, that's in brown here, those are the elastic fibers. These are the collagen fibers, and they're quite a bit bigger than the elastic fibers. And then there's the reticular fibers, which are the smaller ones that you see here. So those 3 different types of fibers, collagen fibers, reticular fibers, and then elastic fibers. And then the ground substance. And in this case, it's hard to tell exactly what kind of ground substance they're showing us, but it fills in the space around the fibers. So we've got the whole view of the characteristics of connective tissue. Scattered cells, many different types, extracellular matrix, which includes fibers and the ground substance. Okay. All right. Well, let's get into the weeds on the different types of cells and the different types of fibers and the different types of ground substances that connective tissue is composed of. So I want to first talk about, we're going to talk about composition. That's going to be our big heading. Okay. But I want to talk a little bit about nomenclature and the names of cells. So one of the things that you're going to need to be aware of is that we can identify mature and immature cells by the ending of the name of that cell. So immature cells and in the term blast. Okay. So, for example, a fibroblast. And there's the ending, okay? Okay. Immature cells. So if you see that ending on the cell, that means it's an immature cell. So this is the plural form. This is a singular form. Okay, why are these immature? Well, a variety of things make them different. And the ones that we want to focus on, or the differences we want to focus on, is they can divide. They can go through mitosis. So these are cells that are capable of reproducing themselves. They also are going to secrete the extracellular matrix. Okay. And what we're talking about here is both the fibers and the ground substance. So they're doing double duty in that they're building. These are the ones that actually build the connective tissue because they produce the extracellular matrix. Both the fibers and the ground substance are being produced by the fibroblast, or fibroblasts, plural. The mature cell is going to end in site. So we can have a fibrocyte. So we can have the immature form of this cell, the fibroblast, or the mature form, fibrocyte. Okay. And these typically have reduced cell division, and sometimes no cell division at all. And they are responsible for maintaining the matrix. So they're involved in maintaining the matrix. Just so that you, when you hear these terms, you know what we're talking about. So I'm going to be using fibroblast or fibrocyte. There's chondrocytes, chondroblasts, so forth and so on. And as long as you pay attention to the end of the word, you'll have a sense of what that cell is capable of doing. Okay. All right. So, with that in mind, let's talk about cells. So, first of all, we'll talk about the fibroblast. Fibroblasts, plural. So this is present in all the general connective tissue types. Okay. It's usually the most numerous cell. Okay. And it produces both the fibers and the ground substance. So those are the fibroblasts. A second type of cell that you'll see are macrophages. And macrophages are part of a large group of cells that are called phagocytes. Okay. So a macrophage is one type of a phagocyte. And macrophages are going to develop into, or develop, I should say, from monocytes. So, without going into much detail, the history and the development of the cells that you find in the blood is quite complex. And this includes both the red blood cells, the white blood cells, as well as the platelets. Very complex set of stages and developmental stages for each of these cells. I don't want to go into that. You'll probably have some exposure to that when you do blood, the chapter on blood. But macrophages are developing from another type of cell called a monocyte. So this is a developmental pathway from monocyte to macrophage. And of course, what was happening is, because they're a phagocyte, is they're enveloping and digesting things. It's like bacteria, dead tissue, what have you. So they're the kind of the vacuum cleaner, the digestive system within the connective tissue. There are two types of monocytes. Number one, fixed macrophages. Fixed macrophages are going to stay within a tissue or organ. So they leave the blood, they enter into some organ, and they stay there for their entire life. Those are fixed macrophages. A good example would be a type of cell that would enter into the lungs. The common name for them is a dust cell, and they wander along the surface of your respiratory membrane. And whenever they run into some sort of matter that's not supposed to be there, they engulf it and try to digest it. So this is a fixed macrophage. The other type are the wandering macrophages. And these macrophages leave the bloodstream, go into the tissues, and then come back into the bloodstream. So they just wander into tissues, and they're usually attracted to tissues that have an infection or damaged. So there's a whole series of signaling molecules that they pay attention to, which cause them to leave the bloodstream and migrate into tissues where they're needed. So these are wandering macrophages. So we have both of these types of macrophages in connective tissue. A third type of cell is a plasma cell. Now, a plasma cell is going to produce antibodies. And as you probably already know, antibodies is part of your immune system. They are the thing that people are looking at and researching with COVID-19. They're trying to find those antibodies that are being most effective in suppressing that virus. And so the effort to find a vaccine for COVID-19 is an effort to find that part of the protein coat of the virus which is giving us the best response, and then seeing if they can reproduce that in a vaccine. So plasma cells are producing the actual antibodies. And they are actually activated B lymphocytes. And now, again, there is a very complex story here in terms of B lymphocytes and T cells and a bunch of other types of cells that are involved in your immune system. We don't need to get into those details. So all we need to know is that a plasma cell can produce an antibody or is producing antibodies. It was a B lymphocyte. When it was activated, it becomes a plasma cell and it starts producing antibodies. So it goes from here to this, and then it produces the antibodies. Okay, so once activation has occurred, we change the name to a plasma cell and it produces the antibodies. So we find those in connective tissues as well. What else? We also have a variety of other cells, and I am missing my other notes. So let's go back, and I'm just going to wing this. So we have mast cells. And mast cells are going to produce a chemical called histamine. Which is part of the inflammatory response. So mast cells are producing a chemical which enhances what we call the inflammatory response. This is a natural part of healing. So inflammation has gotten a bad name recently, but it is a natural part of your body's defense mechanisms to repair itself after some injury or infection has taken place, and mast cells are part of that story. We also have adipocytes. And of course this brings in fat and is a source of energy in the connective tissue. Then we have a variety of white blood cells. And these can include things like eosinophils, neutrophils, these are all cells that we can find in connective tissue. And all of these are associated with the immune system. So all of them are in some way involved in the immune response. So those are your basic cell types that we find in connective tissue. Let's talk a little bit about the extracellular matrix. The extracellular matrix, as you call, is composed of fibers and a ground substance, just to remind ourselves what we're talking about. We're going to focus on the ground substance first, and then we'll talk about fibers. Okay, so ground substance. So the ground substance can be fluid, for example, blood. Okay. It can be a semi-fluid. It could be gelatinous, or it can be calcified. So it has a lot of different consistencies. And those consistencies depends on the amount of water as well as the type of compounds and chemicals that are part of the ground substance. So we have a lot of flexibility in terms of the consistency of ground substance, everything from fluid to solid and everything in between. The functions of the ground substance is that it binds and supports cells. It binds and supports the cells that are found within the connective tissue. It is a medium for the exchange of materials and substances. So cells that are found within the matrix often are getting what they need by way of passage through the ground substance, diffusion through the ground substance. Okay. It plays a role in how the tissue develops, how it migrates, how it proliferates, and how it changes shape and carries out metabolic functions. So it has a huge role, I should say, in how the tissue is going to develop, how it migrates, how it proliferates, how it changes shape, how it carries out metabolic functions. It's extremely important in terms of how connective tissue behaves and functions. Ground substance contains a variety of different things. So it is composed of water. Always water. Sometimes more, sometimes less. Also, another type of molecules called glucose aminoglycans. These are basically polysaccharides. It's a group of molecules, all of which are polysaccharides, but a particular type of polysaccharides, and that's the name of that particular type. Okay. Number 3, proteoglycans. This is a combination of proteins and sugars. And these are very good at trapping water. So there's my protein. So here's my protein. And then we get this branching of the sugars. And you actually ran into these earlier when we're looking at basement membranes. So we get these sugars here. Okay. So proteoglycans is a combination of protein and sugars hooked together, kind of this twig appearance. Okay. And they're very good at trapping water in or within the connective tissue. So it's the combination of the glycoaminoglycans and the proteoglycans that create the consistency and the nature of the ground substance. Embedded in this ground substance is going to be fibers. So let's talk about those fibers. So fibers are going to provide some function to the connective tissue. And that function is, number one, strength. And number two, support. And here's a good way to think about the role of fibers in connective tissue. So I'm assuming that most of you have seen or looked at or witnessed how buildings are being built, and in particular cement or concrete structures. If you've noticed, generally what happens is you're going to build out of wood a form in which you want the concrete to take shape. And then within that form, you're going to, or they bring in a lot of steel bars. They're called rebar. And they create a network of steel bars within that wooden form. And then they come in and pour the cement around those steel bars. So the relationship here is the steel bars, the rebars, are the fibers, and the cement is the ground substance. And just like concrete, those steel bars or the fibers are providing strength and support. Without the steel bars in concrete, you would get fracturing of the structure. Cracks would easily form, and it couldn't resist a lot of stress. So it's very strong but brittle. The steel bars keep it from fracturing and being so brittle. The same is true in connective tissue. So you have the ground substance, and then that ground substance is strengthened by these fibers. And the fibers impart a number of different functions, as we'll see. So there are three types of fibers. And the first one is collagen fibers. Okay. And there are actually 5 different types of collagen fibers, and they're numbered 1 through 5 using Roman numerals. They are very strong. They resist pulling. But they are not stiff. Okay? They have flexibility. So think of a long, thin rod of steel. Very long, thin rod of steel. Now, if I had 2 people at each end of that steel rod, and they tried to pull and stretch the steel rod, they couldn't do it. The steel rod does not stretch, so it resists pulling. But there's flexibility. I can get wave-like action depending on how long and how thick that bar is. I can get flexibility in that bar. So it's flexible, but it doesn't stretch. Okay, that's collagen fibers. Okay. And this is going to be found in most types of connective tissue. So it's very common. That's one type, collagen fibers. A second type of fiber is elastic fibers. So number 2 on our list is elastic fibers. And these are strong, but they're stretchable. Okay. So they can be stretched up to 150% of their resting length. So they're like giant rubber bands. Okay. Strong, but they can flex. Okay. Once they're stretched, they can return to their original shape. Okay. So first, collagen fibers, no stretch, but it's very strong. So they provide a lot of strength to connective tissue. Elastic fibers, they're strong, but they're stretchable. So now the tissue can be stretched a little bit, and then it can, come back to its original shape. So you find a lot of elastic fibers in areas like the skin, in blood vessels, lung tissue. So all of these areas where you want this elastic quality, you have a lot of elastic fibers. And in fact, what happens as you get older, those elastic fibers begin to break down, your skin begins to sag. So I'm experiencing that even as we speak. Number 3, the third type, are the reticular fibers. And this is actually a combination of collagen plus some sugars, glycoproteins attached. Okay. And these provide support. They provide a branching network. Of fibers. And they often make up something called the stroma. Of many soft organs. Right. So some examples would be the spleen, the lymph nodes. What do I mean by stroma? I mean it's the internal structure framework. It's the internal skeletal system of the soft tissue. Because of the branching nature of these fibers, they're really good for forming shapes, and then the soft tissue can be embedded within that branching fiber, and it will hold the shape of the branching fibers. So the reticular fibers give the soft tissue structure, shape, and organization. Those are reticular fibers. Okay. All right, I think we're going to call it an end right here. The next lecture is I'm going to go through all the various different kinds of connective tissue like I did with epithelial tissue. So I'll see you in the very next session, and I bid you adieu.